Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers, sisters, friends and the foes out there. Welcome to another episode of the Blood Brothers podcast with your host, Dilly Hussain. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to remind all the avid podcast listeners that you can find this episode on all 4 seasons on all the major audio platforms. And if you're tuning in via YouTube, don't be cheeky, do remember to click subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. At the time of the filming of this episode, last week, the UK government, via its parliament, passed 2 controversial laws. One was an amendment to an existing bill, and the other was a law that was passed with regards to assisted dying. The other law, which was an amendment, was to do with the decriminalisation of abortion beyond 24 weeks. These 2 laws, from an Islamic perspective, of course, it would be opposed to what the Sharia generally says about taking one's own life, as well as aborting a child without good reason. However, today's guest, I wanted a different perspective, a Christian perspective, a medical perspective, and that is Dr. Calum Miller. Dr. Calum Miller is a research fellow at Blackfriars Hall and a medical doctor working in the NHS. He completed his degree in medicine and surgery at St Hugh's College, University of Oxford in 2015. And obtained a master's degree in biblical studies from the University of Manchester in 2018. Dr. Miller's research interests focus on medical ethics and public policy, particularly with regards to beginning of life ethics, including the ethics of abortion and related matters. He has also published on animal pain, academic freedom, and other questions in philosophy of religion, metaphysics and epistemology. I'm truly honoured to have him on. Dr. Calum, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
How would you like to be addressed? Is Calum too informal?
Calum
or
is fine, yeah.
You sure?
Yeah, go ahead.
Wicked. Now, of course, you know, last week, the UK government, via its parliament, passed 2 laws. One was an amendment to an existing bill, and the other was the assisted dying. You've been quite vocal in your opposition to both of them. And I guess the reason why I reached out to you on X and got you on today is to discuss these 2 laws, how they came about, get a perspective from a Christian perspective, and just discuss how, as a society, as a country, we got where we are today, because you've been quite candid in your critique of the laws, the MPs who supported them, and the wider implications. So I hope you're okay with those subject matters that we're going to discuss.
Absolutely.
I will also obviously touch upon, because it's mentioned in your bio, and I know we spoke about it very briefly, is animal ethics, halal slaughter, and the direction of the right, and a whole host of other topics. And I'm really looking forward to today's convo.
Absolutely, yeah. Happy to be here.
So let's kick off with the assisted dying bill. For listeners and viewers who would want this to be understood in a very simple way, this is euthanasia, right?
Yeah, so euthanasia means kind of mercy killing, or good killing is the original kind of Greek that makes up the words. So it's the idea that there are some ways of killing other human beings that are like benevolent or well-intentioned or good even. So assisted suicide is a kind of euthanasia. So other kinds of euthanasia would involve a doctor, for example, directly killing the patient, whereas assisted suicide means that the doctor gives the patient the poison and the patient takes it themselves. So the doctor doesn't do the direct killing, the patient does that. So there's a slight difference. Assisted suicide is a kind of euthanasia, but they're very closely connected.
So one is basically where the doctor would do it themselves. The other is them providing them with what's required for them to take their own life. Yes?
Exactly, yeah.
Now, from an Islamic perspective, it's very clear that life is not yours to give away.
Right.
Whether it's done from a limited human perspective of mercy and compassion, ultimately, when human life is taken, is ultimately God's decree. That's the Islamic position. So there's no such thing as allowing someone to help them to take their own life. That's very different to life support machine, and whether you want to let someone die naturally when they're entirely surviving on oxygen, let's say, that's different. But assisted dying or suicide generally is, from a consensus point of view, is prohibited. What's the Christian perspective?
The Christian perspective is exactly the same. So yeah, I don't think it would be anything unfamiliar. It's really, like you say, your life is not yours to give away. Your life belongs to God, and therefore it's God's to decide when you have your life, when your life is over, and it's no one's duty and no one's obligation, no one's right to take anyone's life, even their own, because all life is sacred, all life is precious. And I think most of us recognize this. You know, most of us think about suicide and we think suicide prevention. You know, if you see someone on the edge of a bridge, you think, let's do everything we can to stop them from jumping off that bridge. But what the UK Parliament has now said is that for some people on that edge of that bridge, they're actually making a good decision and you should help them. Of course, they don't say do it in that way. They say use poison and through the medical system. But the principle is the same. Whatever your religion, we all know that life is valuable and that suicide is a bad thing. What this government has done is basically legitimize that by saying it can be a good thing. Some people's life really is not valuable and not worth living. And in those cases, we should be able to help them end their lives.
Are there any denominational differences within Christianity with regards to this matter of assisted dying or suicide or euthanasia?
Yeah,
however you want to see it.
Christianity is so broad in a way that, you know, there probably is some fringe denomination, just as within Islam, because, you know, in some kind of parts of Islam, there's no explicit hierarchy and there are different sects. Some people would say these are cults or they're not real Muslims. It's the same with Christianity. There would be fringe groups, some maybe even cults or kind of...
Putting them aside,
I mean, the mainstream of Christianity would be absolutely clear that, yeah, suicide is wrong, it's not permissible. The mainstream would be absolutely, yeah, certain.
And if you don't mind me asking, Calum, what denomination do you subscribe to?
So I'm an evangelical, which means, so evangelical means good news. And it's basically the idea that it doesn't necessarily mean a specific style of church. And there's a variation of theology within that. But evangelical means good news because Christianity is fundamentally not just good advice or a set of rules. It's good news because it says that God became a human precisely for us to die for our sins so that we don't have to pay the price. Now, obviously, I know that's totally different to Islam, and Islam disagrees strongly with that.
Diametrically.
And we don't have to pretend we agree.
No, for sure.
I think it's crazy when religious people get together and say, look, we all believe the same thing deep down. Like, we don't, and that's fine.
I think proper interfaith is accepting our differences.
Exactly.
Not trying to force similarities. We know what the similarities are.
Because we don't need to agree to be friends.
No,
I know you completely disagree with me, and yet we can be friends. So,
For sure.
So Christianity believes that it's good news, and that's what evangelical is about. It's about putting that good news really centrally. We believe that God came to earth as a human to die for our sins, and we want to share that with others. And that good news of God coming for us means that we have to respond with our entire personality, our entire life in response. And so, yeah, it's a broad label. It doesn't neatly map into any particular church. I'm a Protestant, but Catholics would also have many of those similar emphases as well. Yeah.
Sure. So now we've got the religious bit out of the way, both the Islamic position and the Christian position. Let's talk about the moral position of it, or the moral justification. Now, this bill was introduced by Labour MP Kim Leadbeater. If I'm correct, the same bill or a similar bill was attempted in the past, 2014, 2015, Lord Falconer. Are you aware of this? So the idea or the justification is that someone who's seriously terminally unwell, in palliative care, you know, the pain is unbearing, and, you know, they don't want to do this anymore, right? They don't want to be a burden on their families. Basically giving a lot of utility and agency to a person who's at that stage of their life in illness, right? And therefore, they should have the individual freedom, the right to make that call. Now, I know all the Islamic objections to this, right? Which we've just discussed. The life's not yours to give. It's all sacred. You have to see out God's decree, etc. and so forth. How would we counter, or how would you counter to those who say, well, quite frankly, Dilly and Calum, you might not believe it's not our life to give, but we do. And therefore, we don't want to, you know, endure what we're doing. It's painful. It's horrible. You know, we're a burden on ourselves and our family. I just want an end of this. Who the hell are you and your gods to be telling us, from any moral perspective, to not do this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things to say about that, so I'll try and keep it short.
Take your time.
I think the first thing is that there is a recognition, whether you're religious or not, that there are some human rights that exist that are so valuable and so must be so protected that you cannot even choose to violate them yourself, against yourself. So, for example, I did a poll on social media some time ago, and I said, should it be legal to sell yourself into slavery? Should it be legal to sell yourself into slavery? And you can come up with a whole bunch of autonomy arguments. You know, whatever your religion says, it should be my choice. It's my body, my choice. I should be able to do what I want with my body. But actually, when I did that poll in a group of secular young liberal people, the overwhelming majority said no. And they said no, not because we oppose choice or because we oppose autonomy, but because selling yourself into slavery, even if it's your own choice, is just such a fundamental violation of our basic rights and dignity as human beings. And I think it's the same with suicide, is that no one else has the right to kill you because you have the right to life. But the right to life is so fundamental and valuable that we should have a prohibition even on taking it yourself to safeguard that dignity. Now, there are many more practical parts as well. I wanted to mention that just because we can get into this idea that the objections to euthanasia are just purely pragmatic. Like, we don't think it's a good idea. It will be a slippery slope. But I wanted to point out that even aside from the slippery slope, there is a principled argument that secular people can use and that makes sense. But then when you get to sort of the actual empirical evidence, firstly, we see that there is a massive slippery slope. When you start to legalize euthanasia for people in these desperate situations, which all of us sympathize with. I wrestle with my view on this, not because I doubt it, but because I would be sympathetic to taking my own life because I'm just not very good at dealing with suffering personally. But when you look at when this is done, it always expands to more people. So, you know, they will always say in the beginning, it's just for people at the end of life in their final 6 months, which we can never guess accurately anyway. It's only for adults. It's only for people with competence mentally. And then over time, the practice gradually expands so that now in the Netherlands and Belgium, they're talking about killing children, even infants that can't make any decision at all. In Canada, they're talking about killing people simply for having mental health problems. And so once you open the floodgates, it's very hard to limit it to this small group of people who are already at the end of their life. Now, when you look at this question of suffering as a sort of reason for euthanasia, what's interesting is that when you look at the empirical data and from a medical perspective, it's extremely rare that people will undergo assisted suicide or euthanasia because of their physical pain or suffering. That's actually not the main reason at all. It's a minority of patients who do it for that reason. The large majority of people undergoing euthanasia are doing it because they say they feel like they've lost their dignity, they've lost their autonomy because they're dependent on other people to do things for them.
They're a burden on others.
And they're a burden on others.
Yeah.
So in Oregon, which, you know, everyone in the UK has been saying, we're not basing our law on Canada, which is totally insane. We're basing our law on Oregon, which is much more, you know, moderate and strict. When you look in Oregon, nearly half of the people doing it are because they feel like they're a burden on other people. That's crazy. That's horrendous. Some of them even say it's because of financial situations. Like they can't afford to be treated, so they're having the state kill them instead. And so ultimately, these are not physical problems that we're solving through assisted suicide and euthanasia. Our palliative care for physical problems is actually very good when it's done well. And that's at risk now because euthanasia will be a much easier option.
Yeah.
Ultimately, this is an existential problem of meaning and how to deal with a felt loss of dignity. And so our response shouldn't be, you're right, it is embarrassing and humiliating that you can't, you know, wipe yourself clean after going to the toilet.
And here's an option if
you're an embarrassment and your life is degrading, so we should kill you. You're absolutely right. Our option should be no matter how dependent you are, no matter how much you feel like a burden.
You're not.
You're not.
And it's okay.
Exactly.
That's it.
Everyone is a burden to each other.
but wouldn't the family traditionally play this role? Sorry to digress.
Yeah.
I mean, in yesteryears, right? Especially more so in Western European societies, 50, 60, 70 years ago, you'd have a wider support network to rely on to, you know, for people to be around, whether it's more children, more kids, more elderly children to look after you. Wouldn't some of that responsibility of not being made to feel like, you know, the terminally unwell or the elderly are a burden sometimes would fall on the family, or mostly would fall on the family to ensure that they're not being made to feel that way.
Right,
As
absolutely.
As opposed to medical staff.
And I think when you have that family that makes it clear in that way, assisted suicide is generally unthinkable. And so cultures that value the family generally are completely appalled by the idea of assisted suicide. It's only once you get families that break down, that start having higher levels of abuse, even abuse of elders, which is very common, that's when you start getting clamor for assisted suicide. And of course, that can be massively abused. You know, if you want someone to die so that you inherit money, we know that that's a thing. Not everyone is a good person. Not everyone treats their parents well. So I hope it's okay for me to say this. I've noticed in my work as a doctor, there's a massive difference in respect for family and the number of family members that visit patients in hospital depending on ethnic backgrounds.
Muslims have the highest, right?
So yeah, so typically, I work in an area with a high number of Pakistani, Bangladeshi people, and pretty much all the time that it's permissible, there is a massive family there.
And they'll break the law sometimes. So
probably.
Yeah, sometimes. No, we do all the time.
But that's a beautiful thing, because that's how it should be. And I haven't asked them, obviously. I mean, it would be inappropriate to ask my patients this. But I can imagine in those families, the idea that they would kill that person, absolutely unthinkable. Whereas it's all those people that I see from white British families who are just totally alone in hospital, never visited. Those are the people where their family's not there, or their family doesn't like them, or they consider them a burden.
That's sad.
And that's why I think we in the West are in this position.
Now, let's talk a bit more about the bill that was passed. It was passed with, it's quite tight. It was 314 to 291. 9 plus 4, it's about 20 or so votes, right? And we've had the likes of Naz Shah, who's been quite outspoken in opposing it, from Bradford West. Let's talk about some aspects of this law that's been passed. Let's talk about is it 6 months or 3 months if they're terminally...
I believe it's 6 months.
Okay,
yeah.
now that's an issue, because we all know of stories and cases where someone's been told they've been given X month or X amount of time until you're going to pass. They've lived on much longer. Some have recovered. You simply cannot really pinpoint it to a specific time frame. People can recover, people survive, and some people die within that time frame. Is that an issue? Is the time...
Absolutely. So the main person pushing for this bill, Esther Ranson, a former TV presenter from a couple of decades ago, she's the main person. And there's been concern, about the news, basically, where it looks like she has a hotline to 10 Downing Street, sort of telling the government what to do. She had been given a very short time to live. And if this had been legal at that time, she would already be dead, because she would have been suicided.
For sure.
But what we see is that she's still alive a couple of years later, still fighting for this bill, precisely because that prognosis was way, way off. So there are actually good studies that show not even a small minority of big mistakes are made. It's totally unreliable in most cases where how long you have left to live. And so that's a huge concern as well, for sure.
Let's talk about the mental health aspect of it, because I know there was a lot of contention surrounding this. There's a lot of objections to it. I think it's the Royal Institute of Psychiatrists. There was objection, opposition there. When someone's terminally unwell, they're not generally going to be in the right frame of mind.
Right.
All types of things are going to be going through their heads. All types of things. From the religious to the irreligious. If you're the religious and you believe in a heaven and a hell, you're wondering, you hope you've done enough to make it there. If you don't believe in that, there'll be a whole host of array of other things happening. Struggling with pain, burden on family, everything, the deterioration, the dignity, all of that. So generally, it can be argued that that entire period or time frame where they're going through this illness, they may not be entirely, not qualified, but entirely grounded to make that decision of ending their life. Not that we're saying that everyone who's terminally unwell has got mental health issues. We just know that the state of the illness, the way...
Right.
It can affect decision-making processes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, when you look at Oregon, which is supposedly this super strict regime of assisted suicide, a tiny proportion, I think it was like 3%, maybe less than that, of people were given a psychiatric evaluation to see whether they might have depression or anxiety or any sort of condition which might lead them to feel particularly vulnerable to wanting to end their lives. And so we're told that these are the safest laws in the world. There are, super strong safeguards to make sure that it's only people who are fully sound of mind, who have no mental health problems, who just have decided totally rationally that their life is just not tolerable and they can end their lives. When you look at the country we're basing it on, far fewer than 10% of people even get a psychiatric evaluation to see if that's the case.
That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
How could you even get away with not running an assessment before allowing such a thing? Is there a justification for it in Oregon?
I honestly don't know how they try and justify. I mean, it is unjustifiable, so I can't see how they could possibly try. Yeah.
In the build-up to this bill being put through Parliament, are you aware of any significant judicial review or expert review in terms of feeding back a panel review on some of these issues that we've discussed, away from the kind of religious or moral arguments, but more to do with mental health, whether they're fully understood or utilize palliative care, whatever it may be? Are you aware of any major review or objections?
Yeah, I mean, the bill had a committee stage, and it was totally packed with people who support euthanasia. So it was very difficult, and they refused to hear certain people. They got rid of loads of witnesses and that sort of thing. So it was a very skewed sort of gerrymandered process for the committee. So there was a huge amount of expertise, both from the sort of medical side, but also from the patient's experience or the experience of disabled people, that it simply was not listened to and was ignored. As far as I know, not a single disability rights organization supports the bill. And there are many disability rights organizations. Not a single one supports the bill because they realize how vulnerable they will be and the groups of patients they advocate for. Likewise, we know that 90% of palliative care doctors oppose this because they are the ones who most see what palliative care is really like, how effective it is, and the pressures, whether mental health or financial or from the family, the pressures that people can be under at the end of life. So 90% of palliative specialists are against it. And a number of royal colleges came out saying this is a terrible idea. This, even if we don't oppose it in principle, I think a lot of them said this, we're neutral in principle, but this bill is so bad and so dangerous it cannot be implemented. Judges have said that, doctors have said that from so many specialties. So there's huge concerns among the relevant professions that have to actually deal with this. Not only saying, this is bad and it's going to be abused, but literally saying we cannot regulate this. So the bill sponsors are saying this is the safest bill in the world. There's tons of safeguards. The people who are supposed to implement those safeguards are saying that we can't. And yet it's still passing, which I think shows a really concerning disregard for process, disregard for safety on the part of the people voting for it.
Now, I listened to an interview on LBC when Kim Leadbeater
I'm sorry to hear that.
No, but I just thought, but it was interesting because Kim Leadbeater was on, and she was saying that one of the safeguards that would be put in place, obviously I'm talking about, it was about a good couple of weeks ago, and she said that, look, one of the safeguards that will be in place, that there will be certain panels that will review the decision of a patient to, embark on assisted dying. And that'll involve lawyers, that'll involve other people, other experts who can, navigate or ascertain rather, whether this person is in a right fit of state of mind to make that decision. What was your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there have been huge concerns raised about Kim Leadbeater's sort of statement. She said a lot of things that are simply false. She has said these are the safest safeguards in the world. And then at committee stage, they voted against almost all the safeguards. So even the panels and things like that. I can't remember the details of how they changed it in committee, but, they were saying we were going to have a really strict panel to make sure that someone is totally eligible. Yep. And instead of making that stronger at committee, I believe they actually weakened that at committee stage. And then all the amendments that were just putting in safeguards. There was one safeguard that, what was the amendment that they voted on in Parliament at the same day? I think it was to state that someone who is under pressure, or either from their financial situation or being coerced, should be automatically disqualified from receiving assisted suicide. Like if you're under pressure, then you cannot have it. And they explicitly rejected that amendment.
Absurd.
So these panels that exist, firstly, they've watered them down. Secondly, the people implementing them have said, this is unrealistic, we can't do this. Thirdly, they actually have fewer safeguards to implement in the first place. And so all this idea that there are, layers of security and layers of sort of verification, I think is really a smokescreen, because when you look into the detail of it, every single time they have had an opportunity to remove those layers, they have done so. And that's the same with the panel that might be in place.
So now the bill's gone through, many have said that it will not be implemented in practice within this government's tenure until the next elections. If that is the case, then that means we've got another 4 years, 3.5 years. What can be done, really? I guess, are all the stages of opposition to oppose this bill gone now that it's gone through as law? I mean, you've been quite vocal about how, it's angered people and awoken people, more so with the abortion amendment. But what is there to do now? Is it not just a case of accepting that this law has now gone through?
Yeah, so I mean, I probably overstated the momentum that it has, in the sense that normally if the Commons passes a bill, then the House of Lords can amend it, but they generally can't sort of alter. It's very rare, and they generally can't prevent the substance of it from passing.
Yeah.
In this case, I've learned, because it was not a manifesto promise, the House of Lords does actually have authority and would be perfectly within its scope to get rid of it and to block it.
Really?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't part of Keir Starmer's
because
manifesto.
It wasn't part of... I mean, and that makes sense, right? Like, I mean, people voted in a Labour government for certain reasons. They hate the Tories because the Tories are awful. And for a number of other reasons.
And you have to deliver on those manifesto pledges.
But there's nothing about abortion up to birth and killing old people in there. And so if the Commons then says, okay, we're going to abuse this supermajority to pass this incredibly radical legislation that no one has sort of asked for, then yeah, it's absolutely the House of Lords is right to say, hold on, we don't think this is a good idea and we're going to block it. So that is possible. And so for that reason, it's really important to keep fighting and try and prevent this, because we can. Even if it does pass, as you say, because it won't come in this government, we have an election that could potentially block it. Now, at the moment, the only rumour we've heard about blocking it is reform.
Yes, I was just about to say that.
Which, people have very strong opinions on reform either way. The Conservatives also voted, I think 80 or 90% of them voted. I think it was about 80% of the Conservatives voted against it. So I think, if the Conservatives won, which no one believes that, but I suppose they did, there's a good chance they would undo it, even if they haven't talked about doing so yet. But even Labour, well, firstly, Labour, only 56% of Labour voted it. So it was actually quite balanced within Labour. It was really the Liberal Democrats with their 70 or so MPs that really pushed it across the line. So basically, an election, whatever the result, could make a significant difference. Even Jeremy Corbyn's Independent Alliance.
Yeah, for the Muslims.
I think all of them voted against it.
All of them voted.
Was it every single one, even Jeremy
Corbyn?
Corbyn? So... I mean, I don't know if they have a chance of getting a majority, maybe, I don't know. But all that to say, the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party, both of which are fairly small, they were the only parties that were like large majority in favour of this. So any election result potentially could shake it up and potentially block it when the election happens.
So it's not all over then?
It's not all over. So yeah, and that's, I think it's a dangerous thing to think, and I apologise if I communicated that on social media. We absolutely have a chance to block this, and we have to fight with everything we have to try and prevent it, for sure.
Let's now move on to the amendment on the abortion bill. Decriminalisation after 24 weeks. A child can now be aborted right up until the day of birth. The mother does not require any real reason at all for that decision. And there will be no criminal prosecution if a mother decides right up until the day of birth that she wants to end that child's life. There'll be no accountability. There'll be no reprimand of any nature. That's the law now. And the way Parliament voted in this way was far more significant in favour. 379 to 137. Just as a father, as a father, looking at my children when this law passed last week, I was thinking to myself, how could this be passed? How could this be justified? How many mothers voted for this particular bill? Yeah, you know, right up until birth, right? And I'm not even going into the kind of like the 24 weeks, before 24 weeks, when it becomes when they become more formed, their shape. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about the religious stuff. I'm talking about those cases where now it can be done right up until the day of birth. It's truly horrific. What's the Christian position?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I actually have done a lot of reading on the Islamic position on abortion and trying to understand the difference between the different schools of jurisprudence. And it's been interesting to me, I think, that in this country especially, there seems to be a big misunderstanding because they think, okay, if installment is at 120 days, which is the majority Islamic position, but some people disagree and say 40 days or whatever, that means that abortion is okay before that point. And so they say, well, the UK law is kind of okay because the UK law says up to a certain point, abortion's fine on demand. Yeah. When actually my understanding is that even before installment, the overwhelming majority of Islamic jurists say that abortion is still wrong. It just can be allowed in rare situations.
That's the position. And
so I've been concerned, I guess, at how some people have portrayed Islam as being pro-choice up to a certain point, which is not really.
No, that's a mischaracterization. The overwhelming majority is still a position of either prohibition or discouraged. The 40-day v 120-day doesn't necessarily mean at all, actually, that that's just an option that you could utilize whenever you want at will. Right? There's far more accountability with regards to that. Yeah. The Christian position.
So the Christian position is stronger than most Islamic sort of scholars. I know that some Islamic scholars do agree with the Christian position, which is basically to say that unless the woman's life is at risk, then abortion is prohibited. Now, the reason and I think, I didn't come to this position because I'm a Christian. I actually came to it because of medical science. For me, it was firstly that I believe that every human being is valuable, every human being is equal, and therefore the fundamental question is, when does a human being begin to exist? And for me, that was looking at the science and saying, okay, fertilization, we've now discovered, is the beginning of a human development, when the sperm meets the egg and it begins to grow. Yeah. So Christianity has basically followed that position. It always said, from the beginning, life is valuable. But when fertilization was discovered, Christians said, okay, now that science has shown us the first human features, that is when we have to oppose abortion from. Because, for example, say you had a 5-year-old child. You wouldn't say, okay, you can have a 5-year-old child killed because the mother was raped, or because the child has a disability, or because of poverty. And in the Quran, I know it says, do not kill your child out of fear of poverty. You would never do that for a 5-year-old. So the question is, if it is a human being before birth, do those reasons apply? And again, I think just from a consistency point of view, I have to say no. And so the Christian position affirms that. But for me, it was fundamentally a question of when does life begin? But the Christian perspective is stricter than the sort of traditional Islamic perspective in that sense.
Now, with regards to abortion, I'm aware that this is a huge subject, which is very close to the hearts of many practicing Christians, from North America to Europe, to Ireland. I know that there's laws in place which prevent people from congregating next to abortion clinics, which is mainly to do with people coming to do prayers, and obviously the other side have said that this is intimidation and so forth. How grave of a matter is this amendment in terms of, from two perspectives? I'd like you to address it from the standpoint of your own personal faith, or those who identify as Christians or culturally Christian, a new term, and from a medical point of view. Give me the two perspectives.
So just to set a bit of context first, so in the UK, about nearly 1 in 3 pregnancies is aborted. So, we say that abortion should be if the woman's life is at risk. That number of abortions is less than 100 a year in the whole UK. But the number of abortions in general in the UK is 250,000. So out of 250,000 abortions, less than 100 are for the woman's life. So the large majority, 99%, would be contrary to, Christianity or Islam. And so this is a huge issue. And this is why I first got into this issue and saw it as such an important thing, because I said, in this country, 1 in 3 pregnancies is aborted, 250,000 every year. And that is just something that almost no one talks about, and it's a huge issue.
Where is that data cited, if you don't mind me asking?
So the Department of Health publishes it each year. So it's not controversial. It's not from a pro-life thing. It's just Department of Health data show this very clearly, and they even tell you what the reasons are to some extent. So that's why I see this as such a huge issue. Now, most of those abortions are in the first trimester. About 90% are in the first trimester, but some of them go much later. And people will say, look, So previously the law in a way still is, you can have an abortion up to 6 months for mental health reasons. But in practice, mental health means any reason at all. So if you go to a doctor and you say, having a baby girl would affect my mental health, I wanted a baby boy, they can do it legally. And so 6 months for any reason at all in practice, and then up to birth if the baby has a disability or if the woman's life is at risk. What this amendment now says, it doesn't quite legalize it for the doctor up to birth, but it says the woman by herself can do it anytime she wants. So all she needs to do is call the doctor, say, I'm 10 weeks pregnant, can you send me the abortion pills? The doctor can send her the abortion pills. She takes them at home at 8 months and has an abortion by herself at home at 8 months. So from a medical point of view, this is super dangerous because you're doing 8 months of abortions on women with no medical supervision at home. From a legal and an ethical point of view, it's also very worrying. Now, many people will say, people would only ever have abortions that late in pregnancy if it's an absolutely extreme situation, like the woman's life is at risk, or the child has a fatal disability that the child's going to die within a few hours anyway. That is simply not the reality when you look at the statistics and the stories that we know of. So, as one example, Sarah Catt was a woman in the UK who in 2010, she was 39 weeks pregnant. 39 weeks. Literally could have given birth any moment. She had an abortion by herself, and the reason was not she had a medical situation, because that's already legal. If a woman's life is at risk, it's already legal up to birth. She was doing it because she had a 7-year affair and wanted to hide this baby from her husband, so had an abortion at 39 weeks. And she was put in jail for 8 years as a result. And even the large majority of the British public, which, as you know, is overwhelmingly pro-choice, they say it's a woman's choice, it's fine, it shouldn't be criminal or anything like that. Even the pro-choice British public said, this is murder. 39 weeks, if you're having an abortion to cover up an affair, that is infanticide, that is murder, and she should go to jail. What this amendment now says is that not only will she not go to jail, she will have no consequences whatsoever for doing something like that.
How does abortion up to 38, 39 weeks look like for our viewers and listeners who may not be privy to this? What does that actually look like? What's the process?
So it's effectively giving birth, but in a medical context, what they will do is, and they do this if the baby has a disability or even at 22 or 23 weeks, because the baby could be born viably, they have to kill the baby first before they do an abortion in hospitals, before that 24-week limit. So the way they do that is through a procedure called feticide, which gives you a clue what it is. It's killing the fetus. And the way they do that is they get a needle and they put it through the mother's abdomen, and they fill it with either digoxin, which is a drug for heart issues, or potassium chloride. And they stab the baby in the heart with those drugs and inject that chemical into the baby's heart to stop the heart. And then they will induce labor so that the woman still goes through labor. She doesn't even avoid going through labor. She has to give birth. But this time it's to a dead baby. Now, one of those chemicals, potassium chloride, which is often used, we give in certain concentrations in medicine all the time. So I'm not pretending that it's sort of a dangerous, harmful drug in itself. But at the concentrations used to kill human beings, it's actually been banned by vets. Like the World Veterinary Association says you cannot use it in conscious animals because it is torture. It's so painful when you use it in high concentrations. human rights groups have said you cannot use it in capital punishment because it is torture. Even if you're killing a murderer or a rapist or whatever, a war criminal, you cannot kill them using this because it is excruciating torture. But they would use that drug injected straight into the baby's heart to kill the baby after about 21 or 22 weeks, so that the baby, when they're delivered, comes out dead. And so that's the reality of how late-term abortion in the UK works.
You're a father?
I'm not yet.
Okay.
Hopefully in future.
Yeah, it's scary stuff here in this.
I'll mention on that, I found a study recently where they studied nurses and doctors who perform this procedure. And there were some really telling quotes in there. One of them actually said, "We don't want the public to know about this because they would all turn against abortion." So it is the reality that it is genuinely horrifying.
Now, Calum, if we're true to ourselves, you're someone who's very well read, you're an academic, you've written extensively about these topics from an ethical point of view, from your own religious point of view and so forth. And I think we both can agree that whether it's the amendment on the abortion bill or the assisting dying bill, or whether it's the same-sex marriage bill of the past, or whether it's the relationship and sex education bill, all these bills and laws sadly are a reflection of a particular ideology, worldview, whether that's secular liberalism is what I would like to coin it. And actually it's just indicative of far wider issues, whether it's the normalisation of adultery and fornication, whether it's to do with the breakdown of marriage and the family unit. But all these things are indicative of a particular ideology, of a particular worldview or a belief, and one that is arguably detached from God, the hereafter, eternal accountability and so forth. So I posit to you, who or what is behind these laws? Who or what is behind the driving forces of, whether it's interest groups, whether it's those who have financial vested interests? How is it that governments across the Western world, mainstreamed, the loudest voices, are those who want to push these types of policies? Who do you think, who or what is behind it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Firstly, I think, in a democracy, that means ruled by the people. And if some of the people are religious and religion plays an important role in your life, then religion has to play a role in politics. I think it's crazy to say that people should decide, but religious people shouldn't help decide what the laws are. If you have religious people, then religion will have an influence on politics, and that's what true democracy looks like.
They're part of the process.
So religion has to play a role in politics. It doesn't necessarily mean you impose one religion over everyone else as a minority, but it plays a role. The second thing is, I think conservative people, whether they're religious conservative or just secular conservative, there's this idea that sort of we just impose our values about life and the dignity of humans or families and the importance of family structure just because God says so. And we're kind of imposing our religion on anyone else. But that's not the reality. We know that the number one thing that affects how a child is raised, and how a child is raised is important for the rest of their life. The most important thing for a child to do well in life is for them to have an intact family. And so all of these things, whether it's abortion that tells a mother that they can kill their child, tells a father they can abandon their child, and tells a child that they are disposable, whether it's family breakdown, whether it's sex before marriage that leads to broken families before they even form, whether it's, all of these other things, euthanasia, where you say, okay, your parents are not valuable and we can discard them as well. All of these things are not just forbidden in religion because they go against God's law. They're forbidden and they've succeeded, and these religions and their societies have succeeded because they help to form stable families, and stable families are the foundation of a child's development, and a child's development is what's going to set them up for happiness and health in the rest of their life.
It's a bedrock of society and civilization.
Exactly. And so that's why we think these things are so important. And so, many things are important in politics. Geopolitics is important. The economy is important. But I do think that whether you're Christian, Muslim, or any other religion or no religion at all, your values about the family life, education, and what children are taught in schools should be at the very center of your politics as well. It should be something that we have to start voting on and taking seriously. Now, why do I say that? The reason I say that is because so much of what is being pushed, most people in this country disagree with. When you look at the stuff that's being taught to kids in schools about masturbation and all sorts of craziness, you don't have to be Muslim or Christian to say that's bad. Almost
sure.
everyone thinks that's,
Yeah.
adjacent to pedophilia
Yeah.
in many ways.
Yeah.
When it comes to abortion up to birth, almost everyone says this is murder. And so what we're seeing is firstly the massive need for people of goodwill with the right values to get into politics, because the reason this stuff is passing is because people like us are not at the forefront of politics because we're disengaged. So firstly, it's really important that people engage in politics and put these issues at the center of the agenda. But then coming to the question of, well, who is behind it?
Many would describe us as zealots, Calum, would they not?
They can do that if they want.
Especially the way we express ourselves on X, and especially yourself on certain matters. It'd be like Calum and Dilly, or whatever version of them respective selves, are the type of, perhaps, I mean, not to our faces, perhaps, but it's the type of zealousness that we can do without in these types of debates.
Yeah, I mean, I think reasonable people with reasonable opinions can always look like zealots and can always be portrayed as zealots with the right media framing. So it is important that we learn how to communicate in a way that doesn't misrepresent us and that doesn't allow other people to misrepresent us. And of course, there are religious zealots. There are also secular zealots.
For sure.
The people who legalize abortion up to birth are absolutely zealots. And if you want to choose between people who think humans are valuable and shouldn't be killed and people who think abortion should be allowed up to birth, these are the zealots. So yeah, I mean, people can say that. And I realize that, with a lot of scaremongering around Islam in particular, my Muslim friends have told me, look, we don't want to get involved on these issues precisely because
We'd be labelled X, Y, and Z.
Exactly. Whereas Christians can get away with it because they're the sort of traditional religion of the country. And it's funny because Christians see it the other way, or many do.
On the RSC bill, I think Muslims were quite loud.
They were, absolutely. Much
protested
louder.
in Birmingham, protested in
Exactly.
London. We were at the forefront of that.
And that was amazing. And it was a great thing to do. And I commend you for it. And Christians see it the other way often. They say, like, Christians as the sort of dominant oppressive religion are sort of called, everyone hates the Catholic Church, blah, blah, blah. Whereas Muslims on the left are kind of an oppressed minority. And so they can get away with it. And the reality is kind of somewhere in between. Like, both of us can say things in certain places than the other can't.
For sure.
And both of us might be vulnerable in certain places. So what I think we need is to work together and say, look, we all want to protect our children. We all want to protect our families. Let's encourage each other and support each other. And I know it's easy for me to say that when many of my friends and people have not made a space for Muslims to speak out. I hope that we can change that and that Muslims are given a voice to say, please stop this craziness. We want to protect our children. We agree with Christians and people of goodwill, and we want to work together. So in terms of where it all comes from, it is a variety, and there's lots of ideologies historically about this. Population reduction, honestly, is a big part of it. At the beginning of life, it's obvious why, because you can just get rid of population by killing them before birth. And especially in a global context, this is a big part of it. So we know that the UK government, one of their solutions to Boko Haram and other kind of extreme terror groups in Nigeria persecuting Christians, one of the UK government's solutions to that is to promote abortion among Muslims in Nigeria, which is so evil. They're saying because some, small minority of Muslims go into terror, end up in Boko Haram. Because of that, our solution is to kill Muslim babies before birth so that there's a better balance of Christians and Muslims. Yeah. It is unspeakably evil. And so this isn't about me defending Christian babies. I want every baby, whether Muslim or Christian, to be protected. And so part of it is a population reduction. Part of it is geopolitics. You don't even have to say climate change is a scam or anything to agree with this. I don't believe climate change is a scam. But nevertheless, the climate change sort of movement has been hijacked or misused or abused to push for reduction in population. And we can see this with the euthanasia bill as well, that a lot of the funders behind the polling groups are really about population reduction because of climate reasons.
Who would want the world's population to decrease?
So a lot of it is economic, and that's at the beginning and end of life. So at the end of life, people stop contributing to the economy in the standard ways. Of course, they contribute with knowledge, with experience, and with love and family.
Not with labor.
But they don't contribute with labor.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to see how people who just run businesses or run economies or run governments want to kill off the elderly. And they have said this explicitly sometimes, that we need to get rid of them for our economy to survive because we're not having enough babies. Because there are so few babies, there's no one to work to look after the old people.
So why have people stopped having babies?
Because of abortion. So we have to kill them at the end of their life because there aren't enough babies, because we're killing them at the beginning of life. and all of that is, and again, part of that is economic, because if you want women in the working place, you can't have them having children. So, employers will say, we don't want our mothers taking off time and being mothers. We want them in the workplace, 9 to 5 and staying in evenings. And they can't do that if they have babies. So there's a huge, huge push from, people in the economy sector, in finance, in businesses, in governments, to promote abortion and to reduce fertility, basically for those reasons, to keep women in the working place and say, you cannot be mothers because we need to produce. We need to produce everything except children, which are the most important thing in the world. So some of it is women's rights. I'm not pretending everyone has this sinister economic agenda. Some people genuinely believe that to liberate women, they need to kill their babies. I think that's crazy. I think if you take the number one superpower and the unique gift that women have,
motherhood,
and you turn it into an enemy of women and say we need to destroy that and suppress that, you are destroying and suppressing womanhood. So I think it's crazy when people say, in order to be true women and liberated women, they need to kill their children, because the opposite is true. I think the unique gift of women is to bring a new life into the world, and that should be protected and prized rather than destroyed. So the women's rights stuff plays into it. I think it's totally wrong, but it's obviously a big factor.
Brothers and sisters and friends, I see that you're enjoying the content. How come you've not clicked subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel? And if you're watching via Rumble, how come you've not subscribed on our Rumble channel? If you like the content, you like the guests, you like what we're talking about, it's absolutely inexcusable and cheeky for you not to click subscribe. Thank you, and Jazakallah khair. How do you grapple with having those types of personal beliefs, but being a white Christian man in Britain, where there would be a fair amount of people within a spectrum who would still maintain that where Western civilization is now, the way Christianity has reformed, is that these matters ultimately fall within the agency of the individual. Because the founding fathers of, whether it's the Enlightenment and those who have ultimately shaped the very ideas which define Western civilization, it opposes these things. We can take life because utilitarianism basically means that I have the choice. It's me. I decide my life, my happiness, can't infringe on anyone else's, and all of that's normal now. Yes, we're seeing pushbacks. We're seeing it from certain groups on the right, those who are now reconnecting with their Christian identity and so forth. But I swear to you, Calum, even those in the Christian right in America and in Europe would still be people who would vote for these bills. Now, I'm not saying Nigel Farage's defense isn't justified or not, but he wasn't present for the abortion bill.
Right.
Now, he said he was at someone's funeral, one of his friend's funerals. But
okay, I didn't see that.
So I guess what I'm asking you is that, how do you feel about espousing these views and positions, but within a society which is, and a part of the world where this has ultimately become normalized and is being pushed from the most highest echelons of power and corridors of power?
Yeah, I think ultimately individualism is a lie, and we can see the fruits of it. So, when you look at just statistics about people's happiness, about where people get their meaning in life, it's abundantly clear that people with faith are happier, people with families are happier, people who are lonely are more miserable, people who feel like they have no meaning in life feel more miserable, they're more likely to commit suicide, more likely to not just be depressed and have mental health problems, they're more likely to sort of be unable to cope with them and find no way out. And so Honestly, it was interesting. I was in a debate a few months ago with someone, and we were talking about the mental health. It was a public debate with an abortion provider, and we were in a debate about the mental health impact of abortion. And she was saying, look, if there was really a mental health impact of abortion, abortion is so common. 1 in 3 women has an abortion in this country. We would see an epidemic of mental health problems. And my response was like, do you not see an epidemic of mental health problems? That's like all I hear on the news, like every couple of months, is how our society is totally destroyed by mental health problems. Now, I'm not saying all of that is from abortion. It's clearly not. I mean, a lot of it is men. But a lot of it is women, and I think disproportionately young women. Young liberal women are the most susceptible to mental health problems. And so ultimately, you know, when people say individualism is good, autonomy is good, this is what liberalism is about, I would say just look at the fruit that it has borne. You don't have to look to scripture or anything like that. Just say, look at our society. Are we happy? Are we flourishing? Are we doing well? I think by any measure, you would have to say absolutely not. And so the reason, of course, I think is because we have deviated from a plan. And I think it's not that I think the faith traditions, particularly Christianity, but I don't know what, you know, Islam says about the creation of the world. I know there are at least similarities. But Christianity says, at the beginning of the world, humans were created in the image of God. Now that sets a level of individualism and a level of liberalism because it says the individual human being is created in the image of God. Every single human being is protected by God and is valuable and has dignity and therefore has inalienable rights. I mean, it doesn't use this modern language, but that's effectively what it's saying. Every single individual human being is protected because they have human dignity and their life is sacred and valuable. But God creates them not as individuals just pursuing their own desires and doing whatever they want and following their heart. He creates them in a family. Because it's through family and then having children. I say this as someone without kids, so I'm not judging others. But it's having a family and then having children that is the sort of pinnacle of human meaning. And we only are human being in relation to someone else. In the Christian Bible, it says, it is not good for man to be alone. And so God creates Eve, the woman, and they have a kid and they have a family. And that's saying that, look, we should protect the individual as an individual because they're made in the image of God, but we were not made to live as individuals because everything we do has an impact on someone else. We are always dependent on other people for our happiness, for our health, for our well-being. And so the truth is kind of somewhere in the middle. It's not just sort of like collectivist where the individual doesn't matter and you can sacrifice the individual for the good of the whole. But it also says individualism is totally wrong because there's no such thing as an independent person. And if we follow that route, it's anarchy, it's chaos, it's lack of meaning, it's depression. The truth is that we were created with dignity, but we were created to be dependent on one another and to love each other because that is clearly what the empirical evidence shows and the medical evidence shows. That is where people get their meaning, their happiness, and their flourishing. And without other people, societies fall apart. And so that is why we are seeing, you know, the West has absolute material affluence.
Absolutely.
And they have a deep, deep poverty of meaning and family. And what good is that? If everyone's rich, they all have an iPad, they all have an iPhone, but they all feel horrible. Is that a good society? I would say obviously not.
Quite profound when you think about it, that from a material, worldly point of view, there is no denying that what is seen as Western civilization or Western nations, Western liberal democracies, you know, they have the strongest economies, the strongest militaries, you know, the strongest kind of, I wouldn't say, the strongest influence in global politics, soft power, direct power, you name it. But when you look into how society operates, you start seeing something quite diametrically opposed. People have stopped building families. People are having little to no children. A alarmingly aging population, and an even more alarmingly lower birth rate, fertility rate, which, by the way, is across the board everywhere around the world, but particularly acute in the West.
And causes economic problems.
Which causes economic problems because
you
have an aging population, which means there's a labour shortage, which means there's less people to tax because there's less people working. And therefore, you're going to need people coming from outside of the countries who happen to be non-white, non-Christian, and then you have a problem with immigration.
Right.
It's all mixed in there, right? And I guess what I'm trying to say is that when you reflect upon this, and that's where society is heading, how do you see a return to, because I'm sure you'd want it, a more return to more meaningful Christian morals and values? Because a more meaningful Christian morals and values would mean that you would oppose these things and not just oppose one and not the other. Because one of the issues that I've seen is that you'll find some conservatives or traditionalists that will oppose abortion but will support something else. Or they'll support one thing which is clearly biblically prohibited, but then wouldn't really have a problem with something else. As someone who's an academic, a healthcare practitioner, a Christian, how do you see a return or a revival of values and morals that would help rebuild families and communities and societies?
I think some of it is just organic and unexpected. So over the last couple of years, we've seen a massive increase in people going back to church, especially among young people and young men in particular. And I don't know I think part of that is a sort of backlash to kind of liberalism gone crazy, but part of it, I'm sure, is just spontaneous or natural, or, if you believe in God, is an act of God. And so we can't control all of it. And often I say that we can't always kind of strategize our way back to sanity. Sometimes we just have to wait and be ready, so that when people are ready for sanity, we're there with the right infrastructure and arguments and research and people who can make the case for it.
As someone who's an evangelical, there's a proselytized element to that. There's a missionary aspect to that, right? Where you go and convey the message, similar to Islam, if not exactly the same. You go out, you convey the message in whatever shape or form or way, in different fronts, via different institutions, whether it's from a stall in the town centre to higher up in institutions, wherever it may be. Am I correct that you believe in to proselytize the faith?
Of course, yeah. That gives you so much stability in terms of your self-esteem. It gives you motivation. It gives you a sense that your life is valuable. It allows you to cope with the problems of life. And so much changes when that happens. So absolutely, sharing faith is a huge part of that.
But what kind of role do you see that playing in bringing white Europeans or white Westerners back to Christianity? Because a recent study said that less than 50% of Brits now identify with Christianity. People are either adopting atheism, and for whatever reason you may think Muslims are increasing, whether it's from birth rates, immigration, or conversions. There seems to be an increase there, but a kind of steady decline down towards away from Christianity. How do you see?
I see what you mean.
How do you see pulling that back? Because look, as an evangelical Christian, Calum, you want the more Christians, the merrier, right?
Right.
And the more people who believe in Jesus Christ in the way you believe him to be, the merrier, because that just means that people will have a more similar, aligned moral outlook. Right. So how do you see proselytization from your standpoint of faith taking place in Britain in 2025?
Yeah, I think it looks very different. So some people will go on the streets and just shout, and I'm sure that does, some people have never heard it and they're convinced. So I don't blame people for doing that at all. A lot of it will be individual conversations. Some of it might be leaders, whether influencers or political leaders or sports people, just sharing their own faith and seeing it. People begin to look into it more. So I think people are hungry. Everything I've heard about Gen Z and Gen Alpha is that there's such a crisis of meaning that people are hungry for faith, but they don't, because it's such an un-Christian country now, they don't even know what Christianity teaches. And so rather than sort of knowing vaguely what Christianity teaches and thinking it's irrelevant and just ignoring it their whole life, young people are now beginning to think, I didn't really know what this is, and it's kind of strange, but my Christian friends are like, it gives them such meaning and joy, and it's like totally transformed their life. I need to look into this, and what did Jesus really say and teach? And so I think a lot of people are doing that, but of course that needs people to explain who Jesus was and what he taught, whether that's on YouTube and social media or in the town square or just in personal conversations. So I think it's a mix of all of it.
Where do you stand personally? And look, don't hold back. Where do you stand in a prevailing understanding or view amongst those within the right, especially this new emerging right, which is very loudly and proudly reform and pro-Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson and so forth, that actually what's taking place is that many of these European as well as Canadian and previously American governments is that they are placating too much, they are accommodating too much for Muslims, because these are left-leaning woke governments, and Muslims fall within that kind of oppressed minority identity politics category, which by extension there's a DEI factoring or consideration when in positions of power. And actually what's happening is there's a lot of accommodation towards Islam and a kind of erosion of Christian values and morals. Do you think there's truth in that?
I think there's a bit of truth in it, but I think it's, in a way, it's the same with Christianity. I think Islam, in certain groups, there'll be more sympathy towards Islam and Muslims, but there's a parallel trend, which is this: they want the label or the token of Muslim or Christian to get power. They want to fill their quotas, or they want to say, we had the first Muslim prime minister or whatever. Yep. But if someone actually believes it, they're dismissed as a zealot and an extremist.
An extremist standard, yeah, 100%.
Which is why you see people like Sadiq Khan.
Yes.
Who says he's a Muslim.
And he'll be prostrated to a Hindu idol.
He is absolutely...
pro-LGBT to the fullest.
Pro-abortion.
Pro-abortion, all of that.
Hamza Yusuf in Scotland. It was interesting when... I think it was Hamza Yusuf running against Kate Forbes in Scotland to be the first minister.
Yeah, and Kate Forbes was a Calvinist, actually positioned herself to be more towards the Islamic position.
The mosques endorsed Kate Forbes.
Of course they did.
Because they said she actually believes it.
Of course she did, yeah, exactly.
And so I think that's the dynamic. I think just the pure label of Muslim can be helpful in the UK in certain contexts, and you're more likely to get promoted in certain areas. But if you actually believe it, and that affects your practice, you're at a disadvantage.
Yeah, I think that's a good
point. I don't want devout Muslims to watch this and think, okay, well in that case I'm staying out of all this. Because,
no, not at all.
Because we need people of faith. I've been totally harangued and dismissed and abused because I'm a Christian. I believe it and I enter into the public sphere. But I'm fine. And I love doing this, and I love advocating for people who need me, like the unborn child, the elderly, and the vulnerable. And I think if all of us can do that together, we actually can easily have significant influence and change this. I mean, you have people like Stella Creasy. Stella Creasy was one of the main members of parliament in Walthamstow pushing for abortion up to birth. Over the last 10 years, she's been the single biggest MP pushing for abortion up to birth. I think her constituency is 25% Muslim. If they just joined the Labour Party and said, we want a different candidate who's pro-life and pro-family and doesn't believe in this craziness, or if they support an independent alliance person against Stella Creasy, she could easily be removed from Parliament, and you could have someone who genuinely wants to protect kids, wants to protect religious freedom, and just wants to protect Muslims, Christians, atheists, everyone around them, rather than this pro-abortion zealot, Stella Creasy. So, yes, I'm not saying get involved because everything will be rosy. There are problems. The far right is a problem, and I have only come to believe that more recently. I think it's become much more visible in the recent years. But I think if we can find these areas of agreement, if we can show that there are people of goodwill who believe in family, in life, in religious freedom, in tolerance, and who genuinely want to make our society better and reject all this craziness, I believe and I hope that some of these rifts can be healed. And that maybe that's me wishful thinking, but I want to do my best to help make that happen.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, because if you think about it, there's more than 20 Muslim MPs in Parliament, mainly in Labour, but the SNP have a few, the Tory have a couple, I think. But all in all, there's about 20 plus, I think up to 25 Muslim MPs. Now, you'd expect all 25 to oppose the amendment on the abortion bill.
Right.
You'd expect 25 of them in unison, irrespective of the political divide, to vote against the assisted dying bill. You'd expect them to oppose the RSC bill of 2019 or the same-sex marriage bill of 2013. But in many cases, they either abstain from voting or they vote in support of these bills, right? In clear contravention of their own personal religious beliefs. So you were correct in saying that having a Muslim label is all cool and fine, but actually someone who believes and practice and more importantly influences their politics, at that point you'll see that they won't get that far.
Crucially, that's only because we let them.
Of course. Of course.
If we actually just say, it's fine, I'm pro-life, I'm pro-family, I support these things, and if the voters support them, they'll be fine.
Now, another topic I wanted to touch upon was religious slaughter, kosher, halal. In Christianity, is there such a thing as religious slaughter?
Not to my knowledge, which means that if there is, it must be in, a very small part of Christianity. And there will be, Jewish people who convert to Christianity and retain their Jewish practices. So yes, Messianic Jews is what they're called, and they would often keep kosher. But generally, on the whole, it's not really a concept in the same way.
Now, in terms of, you've looked at human ethics. I know during your bio, when I read it out at the beginning, there was something where you touched upon animals as well, right? Do you have a position or any thoughts on kosher and halal and the recent calls by Rupert Lau and others to have it banned?
I don't have a strong opinion because I've looked at sort of the empirical question of whether animals feel pain and how, and it's a very complex question. I'm not super familiar with religious slaughter and how it works, but from my understanding, most animals in the UK are killed in the same way. It's not actually a question of sort of the method of killing, which is, I understand, generally to slit the throat and they bleed to death. The controversy, if I get it correct, and don't take my word for it, is around whether the animal is stunned first.
Yep, stunned and non-stunned.
So in halal, it would be typically it is stunned.
Most of it
90%,
is stunned.
I believe.
Most of it is stunned.
So in that case, there's actually no controversy.
Exactly. The bigger issues with kosher.
So the 10%, of course, the 10% is controversial, but it's 10%, and that's because some Muslim jurists don't allow stunning beforehand.
It's a legitimate difference of opinion, stunned, non-stunned. But kosher
But that would be the part. Whereas kosher, as far as I understand, pretty much all Jewish scholars say stunning is forbidden, and therefore, as far as I understand, all, or certainly most kosher would be done without stunning. And animal rights groups will say that, look, if you do it without stunning the animal first, the animal will feel a lot of pain and suffering as they have their throat slit and so on. Whereas if they're stunned, you can slit the throat, that's fine, because they won't feel it and they won't suffer as a result. The first thing I guess I'd say is I don't like that this is portrayed as like an issue of halal. I think that sort of exposes that this is more about Islam than it is about animal welfare.
For sure.
I mean, suppose that the animal does feel a lot of pain and that 10% of halal slaughtered animals do feel a lot of suffering for 2 minutes. That pales in comparison to the suffering most animals go through in the farming process. Factory farms are notorious in this country. The practices are generally as bad as we hear they are. And if you've never really said anything about a lifetime of suffering that animals go through, and then you're concerned about 2 minutes of suffering before they die, it's hard to believe that that's a real concern for animal suffering. It might be for some people who are just ignorant.
Are you a meat eater?
I am a meat eater, so I don't think animals have the right to life, but I have concerns about how they're treated before that. Because I think animals, they're not made in the image of God. They don't have the same value or dignity as humans, but they're still part of God's creation. They still can suffer, and we should still treat them with that level of respect.
Absolutely.
So I could, as someone who does care about animal welfare, I can see a case for saying stunning should happen. But on the other hand, religious freedom is so under attack in the Western world that I think we should have a strong threshold for violating religious freedom. So I think one of the biggest problems in UK politics is people are very happy to sort of ban something that they don't like and throw away this principle of sort of freedom and liberty that then comes back to bite them. So, for example, some people will only want to ban protests in favor of Palestine, but they want to keep environmentalism protests, or they want to keep whatever other protests. Some people will say, we want to ban people praying silently outside of abortion clinics, just praying in their head 150 meters away. We're going to ban it, but we want to, fight in every way for Extinction Rebellion or for whatever else. So people just don't think in the idea of preserving a consistent level of freedom and liberty for all. It's only about how can I preserve freedom and liberty for this cause. And I think that's a big problem. And so all that to say, religious freedom, I think, is so important for everyone. And Christians have to fight for religious freedom. Muslims and Jews have to fight for religious freedom, because when religious freedom is eroded as a concept, and the more we chip away at it, the more it's going to come back to bite every religion in the end. People are just going to say it's not really a right. And it is a right. It's a fundamental human right to practice your religion. Now, of course, it has limits. You can't say my religion involves child sacrifice and then sacrifice children. Sure. But on the whole, I think we should err on the side of religious freedom unless there's a really, really key reason, like compelling reason not to. Precisely because religious freedom is one of the human rights that is most under attack in the West. When you look at people praying silently outside of abortion clinics in their heads, getting arrested and convicted, when you look at people simply for saying things who are getting arrested, they say they offend another religion, or they sort of stand up for their beliefs about marriage or family, and they get arrested, or they lose their job, whatever it might be. Someone loses their job because they were wearing a cross necklace. There are so many examples. There's a politician in Finland, Päivi Räsänen. She was the Home Secretary of Finland, and she's a government MP right now. But when she initially was prosecuted, she was in opposition. She was prosecuted under the war crimes part of their criminal code for writing a pamphlet that said she believed that marriage was between a man and a woman. Like 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And then she just tweeted a Bible verse a couple of years ago, and that's what initiated it. She tweeted a Bible verse because there was a pride parade in Helsinki, and her church sponsored the pride parade. And she just tweeted to her church. It wasn't anything grossly offensive or homophobic or horrendous or, violent. It just said, how can you support this when the Bible teaches this about marriage between a man and a woman? And she just quoted the Bible. For that, she was prosecuted as a war criminal. So religious freedom is so I know this is a long answer, but I think it's important to emphasize religious freedom is a fundamental human right. It is so under threat in the Western world. And in order to preserve it as much as possible, there are limits. We don't have to stand up for it in absolutely every case, if they're slaughtering children. But I think we should have a very high threshold for violating religious freedom and forcing religious people to do something against their religion, because I think we have to protect that right in general. And therefore, I would strongly err on the side of having religious exemptions when it comes to animal slaughter, even though I am personally uncomfortable with non-stun slaughter. And if no religion had these issues, maybe I would oppose it. But yeah.
When we talk about religious freedoms, especially in the context of the West, religious freedoms ultimately is still, it's a framing that's still a secular framing, right? Mm-hmm. Born out of how secular nation states perceive individual liberty and rights and so forth. Let me ask you a genuine question. Mm. Are you a supporter of religious pluralism? Because if to be a devout Christian or a devout Muslim, and I'm singling out Christianity and Islam here specifically, as the two world religions or faiths that believe that they are the bearers of truth, to avoid eternal damnation and for eternal salvation, that we are the bearers of this truth, the flag bearers of this truth. What's your thoughts on religious pluralism in the Western context? I mean, I go back to what I mentioned earlier, that as a devout Christian, I'm sure you want more people to become Christian, right? So how do you grapple with the fact that on the one hand, we talk of religious freedoms, which means they have to apply to all. including those who worship idols, including those who reject Jesus, including those who don't take Jesus as God, but as a beloved messenger of God. You know, how do you personally grapple or reconcile between being a Christian who believes that I exclusively espouse the truth? Is that a position you hold?
Yeah.
Like Islam is the truth, and if after the message has been conveyed to you, not saying anything about the individual, but in the hereafter, it's going to be problems, right? We espouse those views. So how do you reconcile that with religious freedoms and that for those who are non-Christians?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, I guess listeners can hear this and think like, how do I think about Islam? Just to get it in context. So I believe, you know, I wish everyone was a Christian.
I wish everyone
in the
was a
same way
Muslim.
that you wish everyone was a Muslim.
Absolutely.
So it's not me saying like, I want to kill everyone else or like forcibly convert. It's just saying, I think this is good news that is life-changing, and therefore I want everyone to benefit from that.
And this is
just as you believe the same about
this
Islam.
is the best for you in this life and the next, right?
Exactly. So that's a basic belief that anyone of any religion should share if they really believe it.
How do you reconcile that with now we have to defend the rights of those who worship idols, who associate partners to God, who reject Jesus or take a different understanding of Jesus? I'm saying, how do you personally, as Dr. Calum Miller, how do you reconcile that as someone who's written and discussed extensively, be it about many issues from the standpoint of faith?
Yeah, so I think Christianity has always had a strong tradition of religious freedom because they said that God gave us free will to choose him or not to choose him. And if you force someone to follow God in the right way or follow the right God, however you want to frame it, it's not really going to benefit them. If they're just reluctantly doing the rituals, but they don't actually believe that God became a human for them and ask him for forgiveness and to pay the debt for their sins, that's not going to benefit them if they're just going through the motions.
Like
so
we said,
Christianity,
there's no compulsion in faith.
yeah.
In the
So we have a long tradition, not only at a sort of theoretical philosophical level, but even at a political level. We have a very long tradition of religious freedom and allowing other religions to practice. And of course, part of that was born out of Christianity arose as a cult, as a very unpopular, persecuted church.
How early are you taking this kind of freedom back to? Are you talking pre-Reformation or
Oh yeah, way before the Reformation. I'd have to check, there's a great book called Bullies and Saints by John Dickson, which has a good chapter on this, and it's just a incredibly good summary of church history. Bullies and Saints by John Dickson. He talks about this a lot. I'd have to check the details, but it was, many centuries before the Reformation, like fairly early church.
Okay.
And they said it for these reasons. And so Christianity, grew out of this cult that was despised and persecuted. The early Christians said, we believe that Jesus rose from the dead. We can prove it and show you the evidence. And they were persecuted as a result, and they were willing to die for their faith. So I think that, as well as the philosophical commitment to, freely choosing gods, when Christianity did get political power in the 4th century, that set a strong foundation for religious tolerance. And so that has obviously been complicated throughout history. There have been different positions throughout history. But I think it's very rare that you get, almost impossible to get a nation that is just fully one religion. I mean, nations are big entities. You'd have to be very lucky that every single person in a nation actually follows a religion. And if you go back to, Egypt 2,000 years ago, there were Jewish enclaves in Egypt that didn't follow the state religion. If you go back to Babylon, 500 years before that, there were Jewish people in Babylon trying to practice their religion and being persecuted for it. There have always been small groups of religions in other countries. I don't think you can, even if you wanted to, I don't think you can just exclude a religion from a country.
But that's existence. I'm talking about, the freedom
Fighting
to practice. Yeah, the freedom to practice. Because sure, those small enclaves of Jews living under ancient Egypt wouldn't have been having, from my reading and understanding of it, they wouldn't have been having a great amount of freedoms. Many times they were persecuted.
Yeah.
I'm talking more, I guess. Look, I guess what I'm trying to ask you is this. It would be difficult morally that on the one hand, I believe there to be one God, and Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, is the final messenger, and the Quran is the final message to mankind. and I believe all of God's commands and prohibitions, even if that means I, in my weakness, cannot practice them or obey them fully.
Yeah.
I accept them to be the truth, nothing but the truth, the exclusive truth, to save me in this life and the next. But in that same breath, for me to practice and believe those things in relative freedom and peace, I need to defend this polytheist. And I need to defend this person who believes Jesus is God, in the case of the Christian. How do you, what are your thoughts in reconciling those things?
It's a good question. I think it partly depends on what exactly you're defending. So like, if an Islamic group said, we want to start using this church building, and you're discriminating against us as a church by saying we can't come because we're a Muslim group, I would defend the church. Just as if you wanted to say we can't really have a Christian group worshipping
standard
Christ in our mosque.
Of course.
So like there would be limits. And, you know, I think there are cases where, you know, by defending someone else's freedom, you do compromise your own faith. And so I wouldn't fight for that's what I'm asking. Freedom. So I guess you're right. I would fight for Muslims to worship, but not in a church.
Okay.
So I think there have to be limits to what we can fight for and what we. But I think it doesn't concern me to fight for. It doesn't concern me to fight for a basic level of religious freedom where you carry your fundamental religious practices in a way that don't infringe on someone else's religion, or like in that way, for a couple of reasons. And I'd have to think about this more because it's a genuinely good question. One is just pragmatic, that religious freedom only works if we all support it for each other. And in a pluralistic society, in a globalized world where there are religions and it's inevitable you'll get significant religious groups in the same country, I think it's a practical necessity that we have to support religious freedom so that we can have peace, practice our own religion, and live together as friends and neighbors. But I do think that there's a way in which defending someone else's religion shows them respect. And again, I can see why people would be uncomfortable with it, and there would be lines that I wouldn't cross. Like, I wouldn't say, oh, it's respectful to allow a Muslim to worship in a church, therefore I should do it. I think, no, I wouldn't do that.
That's a red line.
But I think a sort of basic level of toleration to say, yes, we should allow there to be a mosque in this country, we should allow there to be a place for Muslims to pray and for these things, and we should allow them, you know, to wear hijab, etc. Things that don't sort of directly infringe on Christianity, and we disagree with them and we think it's maybe the wrong way to worship God, but they're not sort of outrightly blasphemous and encroaching on our territory in that way. It's hard to articulate.
Do you think Islam and Muslims take a more harsher approach to this?
I'm genuinely curious.
In a more zero tolerance way, like.
I'm genuinely curious because I think part of the problem that we have in this country is because I think both sides reinforce the sort of ghettoization of Islamic communities, because the non-Muslims say, like, we don't want you, go and then partly but from their own desire to stay in a local community, and partly because they're sort of told that there is ghettoization of Islamic communities in this country, and therefore it's genuinely difficult for each side to understand each other. So I've done a lot of work with Muslim groups in places like Indonesia, where Indonesia is a particularly tolerant country, where they have deep respect for the other religions. The mainstream Muslim groups are very respectful towards Christians, fight for their freedoms, etc. And it's very hard to believe that any significant number of them are sort of radicalists who want to kill Christians or want to sort of prevent them from worshipping. On the other hand, when I've said this to some of my Muslim friends or friends from Muslim families in this country, they've said, Calum, even as Muslims, Calum, you're being a bit naive. Like, there are significant communities of Muslims who do have quite radical views and who do want to impose it on other people and that sort of thing.
I wouldn't even call it radical. I think.
Well, I don't, and I honestly don't know. But
I think what they describe as radical might, dare I say, may even be mainstream.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, so this is the issue: is that because people are frightened of these conversations, most people like me wouldn't even raise these issues. Like, to say that some Muslims might be radical, like, they'd be too scared. And so I think we can only genuinely deal with, I think the route to finding peace between Muslims and non-Muslims in this country actually comes from really open, candid dialogue.
Agreed.
Where both sides say, yes, we want to work with Muslims who believe in peace and freedom and loving your neighbor. And yes, we both want to find out how many people have sort of views that might cause problems, and see how can we respond to those and convince those, or whatever it might be. But we can only do it if we're fully candid and actually have these conversations, rather than pretending that, like...
I think, look, Muslims in United Kingdom, and broadly speaking the West, we're not one monolith.
Of course, yeah.
There's various differences, cultural, nationality, sect, theological, political differences.
Right.
But I would say this, and I say this confidently, and I've said this before many times, there are a core set of values and beliefs which I think would be seen as going against the grain of secular liberal norms. And there's many things which we, even as second or third generation British diaspora communities here, quite zero tolerance. Like, for example, 70 years on, Calum, like, my father came here in 1966. I'm second or third. Boyfriend, girlfriends is something which Muslims have not openly assimilated to. Even though there's Muslims who drink alcohol, they won't do it so openly in an accepted way. It's still seen as something very bad. There's still major red lines. It's no secret that most Muslims want their non-Muslim colleagues, friends and peers to become Muslim.
Of course, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And they will probably find any opportunity to convey the message of Islam, or to soften them, or to... This is quite an open thing, I'm saying. It's no secret that Muslims have an affinity with the wider ummah. They're called religionists around the world. That's why, whether they say Iraq or Afghanistan, Gaza, wherever it may be, Muslims have a strong link to the wider Muslim community. Hence why many people who don't like the Islamic community or Muslim community would say, well, that's it, you're a fifth column, you're not truly loyal to the country, to king and nation, and so forth. I think many of these things which I've just articulated are quite mainstream and held by many, but it would be seen as a problem.
I think it depends which bit. So, like, I mean, the fact that Muslims don't drink alcohol, I barely drink alcohol. I have alcohol at communion because you have to have alcohol at communion, and I have it at weddings because Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding.
When was the last time you were tipsy?
Oh, man, like years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So a lot of that stuff we'd agree. And, like, I think... And even I'm fine. If the UK banned alcohol, I'd be fine. As long as they allowed it, again, religious freedom, as long as they allowed it for communion. I think the place where people would rightly become concerned is if it extended to not allowing Christians or other people to worship. Not allowing...
Is that your red line? Like a red line for defending religious freedoms would be if you infringe on my right to practice as a Christian. Would that be a red line of yours?
That certainly would be a red line. I mean, there probably would be others as well, but that would be one of the most important. Like, if for example, you said to me, and who knows if this is true, if you said to me the majority of Muslims in the UK ultimately want alcohol to be prohibited, but they would allow a religious exemption for communion,
you'd back that?
I'd be fine with it. If they said, we want a position where Christians are persecuted, churches cannot be built, you're not free to worship, you're forced to say the Shahada or anything like that, of course not. So for me, it's, anyone naturally wants their worldview to become the majority worldview. Like, secular people want that.
Thank you.
The LGBT people.
Thank you.
Like, Christians want that.
I think we forget that sometimes. That naturally, if you have a worldview which you subscribe to, or an epistemological foundation that you subscribe to, as someone who truly believes in that with conviction, you'd want others to espouse that, subscribe to it, right? Otherwise, why would you take it to be the truth and the best for humanity if you don't want others to share the same, right?
So I think it's issues. I think it would be issues like, you know, violent coercion, prevention of worship, probably things like jizya, you know, taxation of non-Muslims, etc. Like those kinds of things. I think, and I'm not saying this is the majority non-Muslim view. Like, I'm sure there would be lots of people out there who would say, you know, we don't want hijab to be a popular thing around
of course,
the UK.
a burqa ban, or halal meat ban.
For me, the thing that I would strongly worry about from a Muslim majority nation, because we see in many Muslim majority nations, is either, you know, violent coercion or significant infringement on religious freedoms and that sort of thing. So that's for me where the sort of legitimate worry, or the most legitimate worry, could be.
To wrap up, what are your concluding thoughts and reflections on the shifting of the right of Europe politically, and what that means for a revival of Christianity? Is there a link? Isn't there a link? Because my view, before I hand it over to you, is that many of those who lean towards the right, they call themselves cultural Christians.
Yeah.
If you scratch beneath the surface, they don't really live Christian lives.
Right.
Quite publicly, they don't live Christian lives, right? So do you see the shifting towards the right as an opportunity for the revival of Christianity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things about being a Christian is that you don't have a neat politics that falls into right or left. So in the early days of Christianity, Christians would have been seen as like socialist, far left radicals, because they cared about poor people and they wanted provision for that and things. And now we're seen as like Christo-fascists because we don't believe that you should kill your children, things like that. So it's, and that's not just a thing over time. It's not like Christians were left and now they're right. Even now, I would have some views that fit way onto the left, some views that fit way onto the right. And we don't have a home, because our home is the city of God, as Augustine put it. There's the city of man and the city of God. Our home is the city of God, and it doesn't neatly map onto, you know, right-wing politics or left-wing politics. Christians believe that every human being is made in the image of God, and therefore every human being, whatever their religion or background or anything, must be protected and fought for, not only privately, but in the political sphere as well. And so that's where we're at. And sometimes that puts you in the conservative end, like when we're saying children should have a mother and a father, children should be given the right to life and protected during pregnancy, or whether we're saying we think that wars are bad, many of them are unjust, people are being wrongly killed, whether it's, you know, provision for the poor or things like that. Ultimately, our number one allegiance is to God and to honoring his creation by honoring the people he has commanded us to protect, which is your neighbor, everyone. So all of that makes the political question a lot more difficult. And obviously, you know, so I'm someone who at the moment would vote reform just because these are two of the biggest issues to me. But hopefully, as you've seen in this conversation, that's not because I'm like a rabid anti-Muslim fanatic. Like I really appreciate the common values that we have, and I like collaboration. I like finding ways that we can work together on many things. And I support religious freedom. And as I've also honestly said, there are limits to that religious freedom. I'm not going to let you worship in a church. Worship Allah in a church. So I'm trying to just be really candid. I would vote for reform because I think that the slaughter of unborn children at 250,000 a year just is the biggest issue in this country. It's the biggest killing globally, with 50 million abortions a year. And anyone that's willing to push things in the right direction, I can get behind, as long as they're not, you know, if they were Nazis, it would be a different question. But I don't think they're like, they're like that.
The abortion issue, it seems quite a deep issue for you and many Christians.
Of course, yeah.
Why is it so... by the way, the preservation of life is a huge, one of the most important things in Islam. Allah says in the Quran, to save one life is like saving the whole of humanity.
Exactly.
And the preservation of life, you know, the very fact that you can renounce your faith in a life and death situation. Abortion seems to be a core issue for many Christians. Why is that?
I think it's, I mean, again, from the Islamic perspective, I think it's Ibn Arabi who says that infanticide is the greatest sin of all, something along those lines. And I think it's a mix of things. Partly it's just the scale. Like, there are 50 million abortions a year around the world, roughly. There are 250,000 in our country alone. It's 1 in 3 in the population. So on scale, it's just unprecedented. it also attacks the most innocent of human beings at the very beginning of their life. So they're the most innocent and vulnerable. They should be more protected, but actually they're slaughtered for convenience in many cases, and sometimes more serious reasons. It's because it breaks down the family, because it tells a mother that you can kill your child. It tells a father that you can abandon your child and let the mother kill them. And it tells a child that they are disposable. And it tells a whole human being, or it tells everyone, that you're only valuable if you can contribute to society and you're independent. So it's not just about the individual lives lost. It's about the fundamental message that abortion sends to mothers, fathers, children, and cultures that so fundamentally degrades life, degrades the family, and degrades society, that I really think there's just nothing that is parallel to it, especially when you see how common it is with 1 in 3 babies. So that for me is why it's such an important issue. It's not that I've picked a random one. It's not because I like the Republicans. It's like, it's so degrading. And that's why I would particularly so love for Muslims in this country to be involved in it, to come to the March for Life. I don't know whether you follow me on X, I'll advertise the March for Life, or just turn up to the March for Life. If you're worried about being, insulted because you're Muslim, tell me and I'll stand up for you. So we would love to have Muslims engaging on these kinds of issues of the protection of life, the protection of family in the UK. In terms of, I guess, where this country is going, to come back to your original question, you're absolutely right. I think that as the left is so openly hostile to religion, it's natural for Christians to move to the right. Even people like me who pretty pro-immigration, pro-pluralism, I'm moving to the right because it's these kinds of issues that are the most important to me, even though I don't really love reform. And interestingly, Nigel himself has been more kind of pro-collaboration with Muslims than some other reform parties. Yes. He says we've got to work together. We agree on many things. Zia Yusuf obviously being chair, etc. So I don't think reform is a sort of uniform sort of get them out party, and I hope it doesn't become the left. There's obvious reasons any religious people would oppose the left because they've gone totally crazy on these issues. And they're openly hostile to genuinely religious Christians and Muslims. The danger is that the renaissance of cultural Christianity is that it actually sort of insulates or immunizes people against real Christianity.
Thank you. And that is basically what I'd like you to wrap up on.
So in the late 18th and 19th century, slavery was the biggest issue in the world. And William Wilberforce, an evangelical Christian member of parliament, was the main person pushing for it to get abolished. Mm-hmm. And at the time, it was a totally degenerate country. And William Wilberforce then ushered in this period of the Victorian era where religion was much more respected and much more practiced. And there's so many parallels with today. It's fascinating. It's not like we've gone from being a super religious country to gradually declining. It's gone in waves over history. And William Wilberforce wrote a book called Real Christianity. This was a time where, this was the end of the 18th century when the American Revolution was happening. The America was being founded on Christian values. Christianity was spreading to India, spreading to all over the world, Africa. It was the great period of missionary expansion of Christianity in the sort of colonial period. Yep. And so many people would see that as like the heyday of Christian empire. And William Wilberforce wrote a book and said, basically, this country is spiritually dead. And he wrote a book called Real Christianity. And he said, the only hope I have for my country, he said, my country is in total despair. You've got the French Revolution, Napoleon marching across and taking all over Europe, the Americans leaving, huge problems, the slave trade, one of the biggest problems of all. And he said, my only hope, solid hope for this country depends not so much on her armies and navies, but on the assurance that there are still many who love and pray to Christ and depend on him. Mm-hmm. When you've had a period of 1,500 years of this being, more or less, being a Christian country where the leaders are Christian, there's respect paid to Christianity, the coronation rites are Christian, and the state funerals are Christian.
Aesthetics, the ceremonial stuff.
it makes it very easy for it to be spiritually hollow because you've got the outer shell of religion. And that is just as damaging. It's why when Jesus spoke to the Pharisees, he wasn't against Judaism. He wasn't against religion. He was a very devout religious Jew. But he said, you are not really practicing your religion. You are doing all the ceremony, all the rituals, and your heart is totally unchanged and totally cold towards God and towards your neighbor. So Wilberforce said, that is what the UK is like today, 200 years ago. He said, what you really need is genuine, authentic devotion to God that believes that God came to earth to sacrifice himself for our sins, to have your life radically transformed by that. Because if you only have the ritual, it will only make things worse. Because it will be hypocrisy. It will stain the name of Christ. It will stain the name of religion. It will make everyone think Christianity is do whatever you like. And so my worry is that this country will be in that position, where we have people saying Christianity is good, they're sleeping with their girlfriend, they're sleeping with prostitutes, whatever it might be, they're not genuinely transformed. And when that happens, not only do you have hypocrisy, political instability, all of these problems, you actually degrade faith and you degrade Christianity by associating it with those things. So I'm hopeful because I see a lot of people also genuinely going to church and practicing their religion, and a lot of growth of genuine Christianity. But I don't know how many sort of cultural Christians listen to your podcast.
A fair amount do.
To those people, I would say, live it. Live it. You're not going to change the world. You're not going to change your country by being a cultural Christian. If all you have is empty ritual...
Because even Dawkins said he's a cultural Christian.
Right. If all you have is empty ritual, your country is going to continue into decay. What will change this country is people of genuine conviction, having their lives radically transformed, living it at every level to love God and love their neighbor. And that's how we're going to improve this country. Not through culture wars, not through politics, but through genuine heart transformation.
Calum, it was an absolute pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. We went through quite a lot and I've kept you much longer than I initially planned. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Brothers, sisters, friends and foes, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Do remember that you can find this show and all 4 seasons on all the major audio platforms. And if you're tuning in via YouTube, don't be cheeky. Do remember to click subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.